The most transformative knowledge about healing has been deliberately erased from the official Gospels, a teaching so accurate that modern neuroscience is only now beginning to confirm it in psychoneuroimmunology and epigenetics laboratories. This truth could free millions of people from unnecessary suffering, but it has remained hidden for 2 millennia. The disease does not come from outside. It is not divine punishment. It is not bad luck. It is not simply genetics or bacteria isolated from the internal context. Jesus revealed that it has a specific internal, emotional, and spiritual origin that was documented by his Gnostic disciples and then deliberately suppressed. Why? Because a human being who understands that the root of their illness lies within themselves and that the power to heal them also resides there does not need religious intermediaries or control systems to manage their access to the sacred and to health. What I'm about to share with you today is the missing link between Jesus' teachings on healing and the profound concept of the monad, the divine spark that dwells within every human being, the point of connection between the individual and the whole. For the Gnostics, the monad was the divine core, the indivisible particle of pure consciousness that constitutes our true identity. It is precisely this concept that Jesus used when he spoke about the kingdom of heaven within you. The monad is this inner kingdom, this light that when recognized and activated has the power to completely transform our physical reality. To understand what Jesus taught about illness, we first need to understand how the Gnostics understood the relationship between the inner world and the physical world. For them, there is no real separation between what happens in your mind, in your emotions, in your spiritual state, and what manifests in your physical body. The body is not an independent machine that functions according to its own biological laws, isolated from the consciousness that inhabits it. It is the densest and most visible expression of a complete field of consciousness that includes thoughts, emotions, spiritual patterns, and the degree of connection or disconnection of the soul with its origin in the paleoma, what the Gnostics called divine fullness, and which is intimately linked to the concept of the monad. What first becomes unbalanced in the inner world eventually manifests in the outer world of the body. Physical illness is always, from a Gnostic perspective, the final stage of a process that began much earlier in the subtler layers of human experience. It is the body speaking in the only language that a mind disconnected from its inner nature can hear, having ignored the subtler messages for too long. In the Gospel of John chapter 5, Jesus heals a paralytic man who had been unable to walk for 38 years. But what institutional Christianity never explains is the precise instruction Jesus gave him after the healing. He didn't simply tell him to go and live in peace. He said, "See, you have been healed. Sin no more lest something worse happen to you." In the Gnostic context, this statement is not a moral threat. It is a clinical diagnosis. Jesus was pointing out precisely that physical paralysis originated in an internal pattern, in a misalignment with one's own divine nature, with one's monad, and that if this pattern did not transform, the body would manifest the disease again because the cause would remain active. The Gnostics identified 3 fundamental roots from which all disease emerges. They called them the 3 morbid passions of the soul. The first is spiritual ignorance, forgetting one's own luminous nature, living completely identified with the body, personality, and history, without any contact with the spark of the paleoma, with the monad, that constitutes the truest identity of the human being. The second is pathological desire, chronic lack, the sustained feeling that something essential is missing for life to be complete. It is a misalignment with the fullness inherent in the monad. The third is hatred in its multiple forms, sustained resentment, chronic guilt, the relentless judgment of oneself and others. It is the negation of the fundamental unity that the monad represents. These 3 roots are not abstract concepts. They have specific biochemical correlates documented by modern science. Spiritual ignorance, living completely disconnected from any deep inner dimension, disconnected from the monad, produces a chronic activation of the stress axis in the nervous system, which modern researchers directly associate with systemic inflammation, immune suppression, and accelerated cellular aging. Pathological craving produces a chronic frustrated activation of the dopamine reward circuit, which generates states of anxiety, depression, and compulsion with measurable effects on cardiac coherence and the immune system. Sustained resentment produces what psychoneuroimmunology researchers call an inflammatory cytokine storm. Dr. Candace Pear, whose groundbreaking work on neuropeptides showed that emotions have receptors in every cell of the body, documented that sustained negative emotions produce specific chemical compounds that literally inflame tissues. Resentment has a biochemistry, chronic fear has a biochemistry, and that biochemistry produces disease. In the Gnostic Gospel of Philip, a Nag Hammadi text that many scholars consider to preserve direct teachings from the disciples of Jesus, it is described that the word spoken from gnosis, from the direct recognition of one's own luminous nature of the monad, has the power to deconstruct illness from its root, because it attacks the pattern of consciousness that generated it, instead of simply suppressing the physical symptom that is its final expression. Jesus practiced exactly that when he healed. He did not perform external magical rituals. He initiated in the sick person a process of accelerated gnosis, of direct self-knowledge, of recognizing the internal root of the illness, and simultaneously the luminous nature, the monarch that could dissolve that root. When he said to the blind man, "Your faith has healed you," he was not speaking of a passive religious belief. He was describing the effect of active gnosis, of the direct experiential recognition of one's own divine nature of the monad on the nervous system, and through it on the physical body. The phrase he uttered to Martha in the Gospel of John before raising Lazarus from the dead is the most accurate summary of all his teaching on healing. He said, "Did I not tell you that if you believe you will see the glory of God?" In the Gnostic context, seeing the glory of God is not an external supernatural event. It is gnosis, the direct experience of one's own luminous nature of the monad, which, when it genuinely occurs, produces effects that the material world calls miracles, because it has no other vocabulary to describe what happens when consciousness operates from its deepest level, instead of from its conditioned patterns of fear and forgetfulness. Jesus was what the Gnostics called an initiator, a master who initiated in the patient the process of self-knowledge that dissolved the internal root of the disease, that awakened the awareness that the power of healing was not outside, but within. That the hidden wisdom the patient needed was not external medical information, but the direct recognition of their own divine nature of their monad, which was being obscured by the three roots of ignorance, pathological desire, and hatred that generated the disease. Now let's move on to the concrete practices of the true antidote that Jesus transmitted, integrating the concept of the monad as the center of these practices. The first practice is the activation of healing gnosis through self-knowledge. Every morning for 10 minutes, sit in silence and ask yourself the question that the Gnostic masters considered the most therapeutic of all. Not what hurts me, not what symptom do I have, but who am I beyond this body, this emotion, and this story? Allow yourself to feel even briefly the spark of the peleoma, the monad that Jesus taught lives in every human being, as their truest nature. Not as an exercise of imagination, but as active recognition. From this recognition, visualize the light of this spark, this monad expanding towards each area of the body that needs healing. This practice activates cardiac coherence and the parasympathetic response in the nervous system, which researchers at the HeartMath Institute directly associate with the restoration of the immune system. Jesus called this lighting the inner lamp. Neuroscience calls it vagal activation. It's the same process described from two vocabularies separated by 2,000 years. The second practice is the medicinal word. The Gnostics taught that pronouncing with precision and intention the knowledge of one's own nature of the monad has direct therapeutic effects, because the word pronounced from gnosis reorganizes the thought patterns that generate the biochemistry of disease. The practice consists of identifying the internal pattern that you feel is most associated with your illness process, whether it be fear, resentment, lack, or disconnection. And then aloud for 5 consecutive minutes, pronouncing the opposite affirmation based on the recognition of your luminous nature, your monad. Not as a superficial positive affirmation, but as an active gnosis pronounced from genuine contact with the spark of the peleoma, with the monad that you activated in the first practice. The difference between a conventional positive affirmation and the Gnostic medicinal word is precisely that the first comes from the will of the personality. The second comes from the recognition of one's own divine nature, the monad, and their biological effects are completely different. The third practice is the awakening of consciousness through the alchemy of resentment. Sustained resentment is the most documented disease-generating pattern in modern research. Studies of long-term cancer survivors consistently show that the genuine release of resentment is one of the most significant factors associated with remission. Jesus prescribed this directly when he said that forgiveness liberates those who forgive. In Gnostic practice, the process of liberation from resentment does not begin with moral will, but with self-knowledge. First, you identify the root of the resentment, the original pain, the moment of forgetting your divine nature, your monad that made you vulnerable to that harm. Then, from the spark of the plural of the mon, you observe the person or situation that caused the resentment, recognizing that your harm also emerged from your own forgetting of your luminous nature, not as a justification for what you did, but as an understanding of its origin. This profound understanding, which is only possible through gnosis and not through a wounded personality, is what Gnostic texts call alchemy, which transforms poison into medicine, and its effects on the body's biochemistry are immediate and measurable. The fourth practice is connecting with the inner divine with the monad as the primary source of healing. Every night before going to sleep, dedicate 5 minutes to consciously recognizing that the power of healing is not in any external source. It is in the luminous nature of the pleioma in the monad that lives within you. Bring your attention to the center of your chest. Feel the spark, the monad, and from that spark, direct a simple anxiety-free intention toward each area of the body that needs restoration. Not as a plea to an external being, but as an activation of an inner capacity that has always been present, but which the forgetting of one's own divine nature, the monad, kept inaccessible. This nightly practice activates the cellular repair processes that occur naturally during sleep, but which are significantly enhanced when the nervous system enters the state of coherence that the recognition of one's own divine nature of the monad produces. What can you expect from these practices when applied with discipline? During the first 3 days, the morning practice of healing gnosis will produce a physical sensation of warmth and expansion in the center of the chest, which is the parasympathetic nervous system's response to the activation of the vagus nerve through deep self-awareness. This physical sensation is not imagination. It is biological confirmation that the process Jesus described is occurring. In the first week, the consistently pronounced medicinal word will begin to produce moments of mental stillness that contrast dramatically with the habitual thought patterns that generated the biochemistry of the disease. The nervous system is learning a new operating pattern from gnosis from the monad, instead of from forgetting. In the first month, if these practices are maintained consistently without fanaticism but with inner fidelity, the effects cease to be merely subjective. They begin to become concrete. You may notice improved sleep quality, reduction of persistent physical tension, the day, greater mental clarity, a feeling of lightness in the body as if something dense were finally being dissolved, reduction of pain associated with accumulated emotional stress, more energy available throughout. This happens because many physical ailments are fueled by invisible internal overload, repressed guilt, resentment held for years, constant fear, chronic emotional tension, feelings of separation, and spiritual abandonment. The body carries all of that, and it carries on in silence until the moment you stop feeding these structures and begin to release what has been held back for so long. The alchemy of resentment, when truly practiced, is not merely symbolic. It has real consequences because prolonged resentment is not just a negative emotion. It's a form of energetic, mental, and biological imprisonment. When you let go, your body feels it. When you forgive, even in layers, the body feels it. When you stop reliving the same pain internally every day, the body finally begins to emerge from its state of war. And a body that emerges from war can finally to repair itself again. The challenges are predictable. The mind conditioned for years to seek healing exclusively from external sources will resist these practices, telling you that they are insufficient, that you need something more, that this is too simple to be real. This resistance is precisely the pattern of spiritual ignorance that Jesus identified as the root cause of illness, the chronic reliance on external sources of healing as the only valid option. Acknowledge this and practice it anyway. Jesus healed bodies because he understood exactly where illness came from. The disconnection of the soul from its divine nature, from its monad, from forgetting what the human being is at the deepest level. And the antidote he transmitted was not an external ritual or a dogma to be obeyed. It was self-knowledge gnosis, the direct recognition of one's own luminous nature of the monad, which, when it genuinely occurs, simultaneously transforms the consciousness and the biochemistry of the body that this consciousness inhabits. Tonight, before sleeping, practice connecting with the divine within with your monad. 5 minutes center of your chest, the spark, the intention without anxiety towards what needs to be restored, and sleep from that light. The disease was born within, in forgetfulness, in disconnection in the 3 roots that Jesus identified 2,000 years ago, and that modern science is now confirming. Healing also originates within, in self-knowledge, in gnosis, in the recognition of the luminous nature of the monad which never disappeared but simply awaited being remembered. Jesus knew this, and now you know it too. Write in the comments, "I reconnect with my inner monad to heal." Share this video with someone who is going through an illness, because what you just learned could be exactly the healing dimension that no doctor mentioned.